Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're taking a look at a sound that literally defined an entire era. When you hear the word doo-wop, you probably instantly think of 1950s nostalgia, right? You picture diners, glowing jukeboxes, classic cars with big tail fins. But our sources reveal a much deeper story here. Doo-wop wasn't just a fun, nostalgic soundtrack for soda shops. It was a groundbreaking, foundational movement in American pop music that absolutely paved the way for rock and roll, soul, and modern R&B. So we're going to break down how this incredible genre came to be, how it evolved, and, honestly, the rather tragic reality of the industry behind it all.
To really get this music, we have to set the scene first. I want you to picture post-war urban America in the 1940s and 50s. We're talking about bustling cities like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. As this quote perfectly captures, this movement was born under flickering street lamps in alleys, stairwells, and subway stations. Teenagers, many of whom couldn't afford traditional musical instruments, turned the echoing streets of their own neighborhoods into their stages. They took the raw, gritty acoustics of the city and completely transformed them into pure, unfiltered harmony.
All right, moving right along to Section 1, the anatomy of doo-wop.
Okay, let's dive into this. So what actually makes a song a doo-wop song? At its core, it's a subgenre of rhythm and blues, but the real magic here lies in how it was performed. Because these young singers rarely had access to expensive studio bands or instruments, they essentially replaced drums and bass with their own vocal cords. Actually, scratch that. They didn't just replace them, they became the instruments. They built this deeply engaging melodic line over a simple beat, mostly a cappella or with super light instrumentation. It was entirely about the human voice doing the heavy lifting.
Breaking it down a bit further, our sources identify 5 core elements that make up the genre. First, it's all about the group ensemble, working together as one unit. Second, there's a massive vocal range at play. You typically have this high tenor or falsetto floating way up top, while the baritone and bass blend together to anchor the bottom. Third, we have the use of nonsense syllables to keep the rhythm. Fourth, a very simple, heavy beat. And fifth, straightforward music and lyrics. Usually focusing on the intense trials and ecstasies of young love and heartbreak. And actually, the phrase doo-wop itself brilliantly illustrates that third point, the nonsense syllables. It's kind of like a giant puzzle of sound. Groups use these expressions as musical mimicry. For instance, the group The Ravens would sing doomph doomph to imitate the plucking of a stand-up double bass. In the early 50s, groups like the Five Keys popularized what they called blow harmonies. They'd make a how sound by abruptly forcing air out of their mouths to support the background vocals. It was just incredibly inventive.
Which brings us to Section 2, Born on the Streets.
So where did this amazing vocal invention actually come from? Well, the grassroots origins of doo-wop are deeply tied to black communities across the East Coast and in places like Chicago and Los Angeles. Cash-strapped youth used the natural acoustics of the city to carve out a sense of identity. They practiced in tiled bathrooms, high school washrooms, echoing hallways, anywhere with good natural reverb. They drew heavy inspiration from gospel, jazz, and earlier vocal harmony groups like the Ink Spots. But here's an absolutely mind-blowing detail from our sources. Some of the earliest groups actually practiced harmonizing on moving streetcars. They would literally use the rumble and noise of the train to match pitch and stay in tune. I mean, that is true dedication to the craft, right?
And all that relentless practice eventually broke into the mainstream. In 1948, a Baltimore group called the Orioles released a track called It's Too Soon to Know. A lot of historians actually point to this as the very first true doo-wop hit. The idea spread like wildfire as it crossed over from the race records chart right onto the mainstream pop charts. Their lead singer, Sonny Till, had this soft, high-pitched tenor and became a massive teen sex symbol. The Orioles essentially set a brand new standard for emotional, direct performance that hundreds of other street corner groups immediately tried to copy.
Let's move on to Section 3, the Golden Era. That success brings us directly into the 1950s, the commercial explosion and absolute peak of the genre. As doo-wop blew up, it went through this really fascinating chronological evolution. We start with paleo doo-wop in the early 50s, which still heavily held onto its gospel and R&B roots. Then, right around 1955 to 1959, we had classical doo-wop. This is where you get those incredibly tight, sweet harmonies and the heavy use of those rhythmic nonsense syllables we just talked about. By the early 60s, we enter neo doo-wop. This was almost a revival period where things like exaggerated falsettos and deep booming bass lines became super pronounced. Finally, post-1964, the genre largely faded out as a mainstream force, making way for Motown and the British invasion.
Now, what's really interesting is how the genre splintered into these unique subgenres as it absorbed new talent.
You had Schoolboy Doo-Wop, which featured ultra-high tenor leads sung by very young teens, perfectly embodied by Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers. Then there was Gang Doo-Wop, which took a much rougher, swaggering approach from groups like the Channels. And you also had Italo Doo-Wop, young Italian-American guys in neighborhoods like the Bronx and Brooklyn who shared a very similar background of singing in church and hanging on street corners, fully embraced the sound. This led to massive hits from groups like Dion and the Belmonts.
Now we need to shift gears a bit. Section 4, the business of exploitation. Beneath all those sweet harmonies and the upbeat innocence of teenage romance, there was a much darker side to the 1950s record industry, which brings up a shocking but absolutely crucial question we have to ask as we look at the historical data. Why did so many of these original street corner pioneers, the kids who created top-charting timeless hits, end up dying broke?
Well, our sources lay out the systemic failures pretty clearly, and it's a tough pill to swallow. First off, many of these groups were just kids, totally uneducated in the complex legalities of the music business. They routinely signed contracts that gave away their song rights entirely. Label executives like Herman Lubinsky over at Savoy Records were notoriously known to take advantage of these young singers. They'd pay them pennies in royalties while the labels raked in a fortune. Add in widespread confusion over licensing systems like ASCAP and BMI, plus the rampant racial and economic inequalities of the 1950s, and you have a perfect storm. It was a system where uneducated, marginalized youth were easily separated from the financial rewards of their own art.
A really prime example of this financial drain was the devastating industry practice of covers. Take the song Shaboom. The Chords, an African-American group, released the original R&B hit, and it was a smash. It reached number 5 on the pop charts. But just months later, a white Canadian group called the Crew Cuts released a cover version of the exact same song. And get this, the Crew Cuts version shot straight to number 1 and stayed there for 9 weeks, completely eclipsing the original creators.
And note, this wasn't just some isolated incident. The Fontaine sisters covering the Charms, Pat Boone covering the Eldorados, the Diamonds covering the Gladiolas. The crucial point here is that these white cover artists routinely scored much higher on the Billboard charts. Because of how radio play and the industry were segregated at the time, this practice, legally yet incredibly unfairly, drained the majority of the financial rewards directly away from the original African-American groups who had engineered the sound in the first place.
But the story doesn't end in the 60s. Section 5. An immortal echo.
Despite all that exploitation and its eventual fade from the top of the pop charts, doo-wop refused to stay buried. The music just lived on. In 1962, a young Frank Zappa actually co-wrote a doo-wop tribute song called Memories of El Monte. Jumping ahead of the late 80s and 90s, major Hollywood films like American Graffiti, Stand By Me, and Dirty Dancing heavily utilized doo-wop in their soundtracks, exposing those beautiful harmonies to a completely new generation. In 1993, Huey Lewis and the News hit the top 10 with an a cappella doo-wop cover of It's All Right. And looking at today, the massive popularity of the modern a cappella movement, think of the Pitch Perfect movies, owes an enormous structural debt to the vocal arrangements perfected on those 1950s street corners.
So, that leaves us with this final thought to wrap up today's explainer. Can a sound built from heartache, harmony, and hope ever really die? Doo-wop might have lost its spot at the very top of the charts a long time ago, but its DNA is permanently woven right into the fabric of modern pop, soul, and R&B. The next time you hear a tightly layered vocal harmony on the radio, I want you to remember those young, exploited pioneers who stood under flickering street lamps and used absolutely nothing but their voices to change music history forever. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep listening, and I'll catch you on the next one.